Welcome everyone to the fifth class of our 6-week online course on New England research. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Director of Education and Online Programs here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. Once again, I will be moderating today's event. So far in this course, we've discussed Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Now we move to the smallest state in the region and the country, Rhode Island. So giving this presentation is senior genealogist Rhonda McClure. Rhonda is a nationally recognized professional genealogist and lecturer specializing in New England and celebrity research as well as computer genealogy. She is the compiler of more than 120 celebrity family trees, has been a contributing editor for Heritage Quest magazine, Biography magazine, and was a contributor to the History Channel magazine and American History magazine. In addition to numerous articles, she is the author of 10 books, including the award-winning The Complete Idiot's Guide to Online Genealogy, Finding Your Famous and Infamous Ancestors, and Digitizing Your Family History. She is also the editor of the upcoming edition of the Genealogist Handbook for New England Research, which we've mentioned in nearly every class so far. Her areas of expertise include immigration and naturalization, late 19th and early 20th century urban research, New England, Midwest, Southern, German, Italian, Scottish, Irish, French Canadian, and New Brunswick research. So similar to other classes in this course, Rhonda will begin by presenting a brief history of the state, followed by some go-to published guides, and much of tonight's class will be focused on what records exist, how to find them, and how to make the most of those resources in your family history research. And then we'll wrap up with a look at some additional resources and repositories. You'll find a handout, or you'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, as well as a handout. And starting tomorrow, you'll be able to watch a recording of this presentation on that course page. And of course, before moving on, I do want to note that we are still broadcasting from our homes to your home with various limitations and distractions. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. If we do lose the connection for any reason, not to worry, you will still have access to a full recording on the webpage. And again, just make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the chat panel, and Rhonda will be able to answer as many as she can during 3 Q&A sessions. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Rhonda.
Good evening, everyone. Rhonda McClure here, and although Rhode Island is the tiniest of the states, it can certainly give you the most research time and steps that you must take to work through the records. But before we get into those records, let's go ahead and talk about the history of Rhode Island. It is currently the tiniest state with the largest name. It is known as the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation. However, they are in the process of trying to eliminate the end of that, and it would just be Rhode Island. There's legislation that's being worked on currently to get rid of Providence Plantation. It was originally settled between 1636 and 1642. Aquidneck Island comprised Newport and Portsmouth, which was known as the Rhode Island part of the new area. And then along the northern Narragansett Bay, you had Providence and Warwick, which were the Providence Plantation sections. In 1644, the 4 towns received their charter, and that charter coincided with boundaries with the Massachusetts or the Plymouth Bay, the Plymouth colony, so that all of the borders lined up. In 1663, a royal charter that guaranteed, among other things, religious tolerance kind of messed up that a little bit with our borders. So going forward, what started out as everybody getting along great, we end up with some conflicting rights for different royal charters, causing these border disputes that are going to affect where you look for some of your records. For instance, the western border with Connecticut was in question back and forth, especially during the 1600s. But the biggest border issue you're going to see is between Massachusetts and Rhode Island along the Rhode Island eastern border. And that's going to affect where certain records are found. That border dispute with Massachusetts took a long time to settle. In 1746, lands that now make up the towns of Barrington, Bristol, Cumberland, Little Compton, Tiverton, and Warren were actually transferred to Rhode Island. Then in 1828, part of Seekonk, Mass. Was ceded to Rhode Island and joined with part of North Providence to become Pawtucket. I'm sure you're all busily designing your little family tree of places here. And then in 1862, the final slice, the western part of Seekonk was transferred to Rhode Island and becomes the town of East Providence. Some of the towns in Bristol County, Massachusetts, that are there today have at times been part of Rhode Island, and one of those towns is the town of Swansea. So most of your records will be in Massachusetts, but don't be surprised if something is all of a sudden saying, I am of Swansea, Rhode Island. It is because, again, this border kept going back and forth. Looking at how all of this happened, you can see from our little map here where Bristol County, Rhode Island is, that was created in 1747 out of Bristol County, Massachusetts. And you will see that the towns of Cumberland, Pawtucket, and East Providence that were also ceded are going to become parts of Providence County, while Little Compton and Tiverton from the 1746 land transfer become part of Newport County. So you've got a little bit of lands going here, there, and everywhere, with Barrington, Bristol, and Warren kind of making up Bristol County, Rhode Island. So keep this kind of geography in mind, especially when you're researching, and if you are researching in any of those towns that do kind of butt up against Massachusetts, because you may find some of your resources are going to be in Massachusetts. Before we launch into talking about the records, there are a number of published guides that I love to mention, especially when it comes to New England. These include some that most people look at the copyright dates and their first comment is, why? These are too old. Just because they are from, say, the 80s or 90s doesn't mean that they don't hold valuable resources for us. Some of these include things like the New England Genealogical Research, a guide to sources by Kip Sperry, our current edition of the Genealogist Handbook for New England Research, which is in its 5th edition, and then one of my favorites, Genealogical Research in New England. So we're going to take a look at a couple of these so that you can kind of get a sense of why I think these are important. So genealogical research in New England is designed with chapters devoted to each of the New England states, and those chapters are a narrative, and they often talk about some of the idiosyncrasies of the records. This is something that you don't get when you're just researching in records. So it can be really important to see if you can get a copy of this book from your library, etc., and just read up so that you don't end up wasting time looking for something that either was never created or was created but exists somewhere else today. Obviously, one of the best parts about our current edition of the Genealogist Handbook for New England Research is not only that we get the kind of a synopsis up front that includes history and some of the major record groups, but it's the charts that are included that tell you when each of the towns was incorporated and if there were parent towns that it was coming out of, because sometimes you have to go back. Your person may never have moved from his farm or her, home, and yet you have to go back through towns. So understanding all of the, which town came first, etc., can be very important. Also, the New England Research Guide gives you columns that tell you about some major sources that are available for vital records and church records that can lead you to knowing whether or not to look for something, or if you have to try and get really creative with your research. All of those initials are explained at the very beginning, just before the chart is shows up in the book. Some of my other go-to books that I think are useful are things like a bibliography of American county histories, Ancestry's Red Book, the library, and genealogical research methods and sources. Now, the library, yes. Do we do tons of things on the internet with the quote films that we used to go look at at the Family History Library? Absolutely. But a book like this can help you to understand how things may be organized, and maybe give you an idea of how to work around something when you're having trouble finding it, a film or something. The Red Book is very similar to our Guide to New England. However, in addition to having the New England states, it's for all the states in the US. So you get some kind of background information on availability of records, any record destruction, etc. And then you also get useful charts. This one showing for Rhode Island shows us when the land and probate is begun, and then what court the particular town would have, because in Rhode Island, only the court records are on a county level. So that's why you're getting a name there instead of a time. But it, again, can be a very useful resource for a quick check or quick lookup. It's available on a couple of places online. I prefer the book. I'm still a tangible person in some instances, and I like being able to flip through the pages. So we're going to talk about our key records. And among those records, we have obviously vital records, because everybody says New England is spoiled. We have vital records that go on for days. This is true. We're also going to look at probate records, deeds. I'm going to talk a little bit about church records, and then a couple of the state-specific record groups that can prove useful in doing your Rhode Island research, one of which I think you may not think is going to be very valuable. So let's get started with our vital records. First off, understand that statewide registration did not begin in Rhode Island until 1853. This does not mean that if you have somebody who was born in 1680 that you can't find them. What it means is there's no statewide compilation that may help you, especially not at the State Vital Statistics Office. Most of our towns have been recording vital records since the incorporation of the town. That's why those charts that I showed you are so important, because they tell you when that happened. The vital records are usually found in the town records. And by usually, I mean that there's a lot of books that the town clerks have, and maybe he just happened to have the wrong one open and he might have put something in a different book, but the theory is that you should start with the town records. Sometimes they've offset that and have actual vital record books instead that separate them out. Not in the early time period, though. And then there's an awesome pre-1850 compilation of births, marriages, and deaths that can be found in James N. Arnold's 21-volume Vital Record of Rhode Island, 1636 to 1850, which is usually everybody's go-to when it comes to looking for early vital records. But before we get into the early stuff, let's take a look at some of the things that you can do with those that begin and have the indexes that start around 1853. There are indexes that go up to 1900, and then there are some indexes that go past that may be available either by state, for the whole state, or by county in some situations, or town. This is an example of the pre-1900 index for births. And one of the things that can throw people is as you're looking at the top line and you're looking at all of the column headings, are the final three headings, which are BK-PG and then CT. What happens often is that when you look at this quickly, you think of book and you think of volume. So we have Bessie Mabel King underlined here. And if you look just at her book and page, you may be looking for a volume 75 for her actual vital record. But if you slide back over to her birth date, and if you look at all of the birth dates and compare them to that book column, you will see that it's the last 2 digits of the year of the birth. So yes, the books have volume numbers, but they do not coincide with the numbers you're seeing here. These are year numbers. But then the page number is exactly where you would expect it to be. And then the CT number, certificate, whatever you want to call it, is actually the line number of these large registers that have multiple entries per page. So as we look at the large overview of Bessie Mabel's birth, you can see at the very, very top, it's page 256. It's telling us that the births were registered in the town of Scituate and for the year ending December 31st, 1875. What's important about this is the fact that these records this register pages were being filled out after the fact. So all the town records, all the birth, marriages, and deaths for the town of Scituate had been put in the town books, and now they're being passed along to the state registrar. So you'll find that all of these were pretty much entered on February 4th of 1876. So the early part of the following year. And if you go all the way down, you'll see a red arrow, and that is where Bessie Mabel King's birth appears. And it is line 30. I did count it. So if we zoom in on just her and take a look at this, what we'll see is that, as I said, the register pages themselves were filled out on the 4th of February, 1876. However, she herself was born the 30th of June, 1875. Now, I've kind of cropped this so we could make these lines bigger for you so you could see them. She has ditto marks for her being a female and white. So just to the right of her name are those ditto marks. The next column shows that she is the first child of her parents. So that's what that 1 means. And then the next 2 columns that have 19s in them are the ages of her parents. So her father was 19 and her mother was 19 at the time of her birth. Not surprising that she is the first child of this couple. Going on to our second page, the next thing we find are the names of her parents, followed by their residence, which in this case is a ditto mark again, because it's all Scituate, then her father's occupation, and then their places of birth. So the father was born in Scituate, Rhode Island, and the mother was born in Cumberland, Rhode Island. So a lot of great information on these pages. It's just important that you look at the column headings and pay close attention to them. And remember that this is a transcription of another record, so it's possible that there's an error in there. If you can find the original at the town level, you may need to do so. As I mentioned, we have the published vital records by James N. Arnold, and his compilation, he arranged them alphabetically, which is good for us because then we don't have to work really, really hard. What that does do, of course, is it does remove that opportunity to analyze how the families are structured on a page and to gather whether or not like a whole family went in and said, hey, here we are, here's all our kids' births, etc. However, what he did do, and this is exciting, is that along the left-hand side, you will see the volume and page number of the original record where he found and abstracted it. So, and then these volumes, the first 7 make up the vital records, and then of the remaining volumes, there's many other things. The good news is that this is a collection that has been made available on AmericanAncestors.org. The first 12 volumes have been digitized and put on American Ancestors, And what's nice about it is that you can kind of get a sense of how they're arranged. So you could do a search or you can browse the collection, however you want to do it, but then you can pull down the volume and notice that we have each volume from 1 through 6 has the counties. Then we have volume 7 is Friends and Ministers, volume 8 Episcopal and Congregational, volume 9, not surprisingly, we've got a little bit of Seekonk, etc., because of that whole give and take going on. Volumes 10 and 11 are some church records and town records, and then volume 12 had revolutionary rolls. Understand that each of these volumes has multiple sections. So if you look at where we have Kent County volume 1 as our selection, if you go over to where you see the page and then you see of, and then there's a 4-100, that tells me there's 4 parts to this. So there's 4 sections, 4 towns, whatever, within Kent County that have been abstracted. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And you'll want to, if nothing else, maybe download or print out the contents page so that you know where you're finding things. Also, as I mentioned, there are 21 volumes to this collection. Volumes 13 through 21, which are still only in book form, are records that were abstracted from Rhode Island newspapers. So between all 21 volumes, you have a good chance of catching your ancestor in this time period. One of the things that I do want to call attention to with Arnold is his Quaker records. Now, the Quakers do not use the names of weeks, or the names of the days of the week, or the names of the months of the year. And so Quaker records are recorded a very certain way. Most of the time, Arnold did record them in this manner. However, you may occasionally see where he didn't for whatever reason. Like I said, that would not be a Quaker way. So somehow along the way, it has been, transcribed, transliterated, whatever you want to call it. And you have to remember that if you're looking at any dates that are pre-1752, keep in mind what the first month of the year was. It is not January. The other thing that is kind of missing from the Quaker marriage records that he has put into his collection is the actual wonderful resource that the original marriage records are. And we'll talk more about Quaker records as we get into the churches, but because these are the records that you will see, it's important to know that once you've found a marriage in Arnold, try to see if you can find where that original is, because below the text or the narrative of the couple getting married, you're going to see a lot of signatures, and those signatures can be very, very important. On our left-hand side, we have under on the right hand of the left-hand side, shall I say, we've got a bunch of Borden family members, and these are all people who are undoubtedly related to the bride herself. So that can be very, very important, and a lot of times people skip that once they find the date. They don't go the extra step. Keep that in mind. So another thing, as we compare these marriages to what Arnold puts in them, you'll see that under the Rhode Island Friends record marriages that I've shown in Arnold, we see Joseph Borden of Matthew and Elizabeth Breyer of Joseph. And in this case, it says that they were married in Newport on April 8th, 1718. As I look at the actual marriage itself, there's a lot of handwriting in there, but I have underlined the exact date that they're using in the record, which is that it took place on the 8th day of the 2nd month of 1718. That was not April 8th. I get why that was put there, but remember that the first day of the month of the year was March 25th in this time frame, pre-18 pre-1752. So the second month is going to be roughly the 25th of May, give or take. From that point, you want to count dates. And so it's looking like the actual marriage date probably took closer to what we would have called the 2nd of May, 1718. And I will tell you that the first time that I was looking at this particular record, at the very end where it says, 708, and it looks like it's just 708. Apparently the EEN is sort of very, very tinily written. And so it threw me at first, and I thought, whoa, he's really off. He's off by 10 years. But looking before and after this particular marriage, I realized, no, these were taking place in 1718. So sometimes the handwriting can lead you astray. Always look before and after a record.
All right, so let's pause here and see if you have any questions. Go ahead and type them into the chat panel. So just going back to the index and the first kind of book of vital records that you showed, births, where did you find those?
So you can find them, we have them in our library at on Newbury Street in Boston, which I know a lot of people can't get to right now because even we can't get there. But there's also, you may be able to access it through Family Search. I believe they do require you to go to an affiliate library or a Family Search Center. I think I noticed that the last time I went looking. And so again, you may be stalled on some of this until you can start getting back into some of these buildings. Once we discover a new normal. But they are usually found in a number, like I said, Family Search would definitely have them. Also, obviously, some of the repositories in Rhode Island would have them as well.
And same thing with the Quaker records that you showed. Where are those kind of original records or the digitized images that you could find?
So in your handouts, I included a PDF with a link, which is my go-to source for all New England records, for Quaker records. It talks about when each of the meetings was founded, out of what it was founded, what records exist, etc. We have all of those on microfilm, and I want to say that, again, they are available on Family Search in a digital format, and I'm trying to remember if I've looked at those since I've been home to see if I had to pull them, like if I could get into them, and I honestly don't remember. But they are available through the Family Search. You may want to try looking under the town after you've looked at the PDF of the book that I shared in the handout, so that you know exactly which town you want to search. Because if you just do Rhode Island, you're not going to get them. They're very town specific. So that's usually my go-to.
All right, thanks. And we have a few questions about some published records and other recommendations that you might have. So first, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but Robert asks, how current is the book that you showed, Genealogical Research in New England? I think it was the blue cover.
The blue cover. Okay, so that was published in 1988. Again, it's in your handout with full publishing. And so the reason I bring these up is because, yes, are they going to tell you where stuff is online? Absolutely not. Are they going to tell you how to use the records so that maybe when you get to the online versions, you have a better understanding what you're looking at, maybe that you've got to look, images before, images after, etc. Yes. So that's why I keep bringing them up, even though we're getting into this fully digital age. We're getting too comfortable with type in a name, take us to an exact image, and we don't bother to look before or after that image to see exactly what it is that we're looking at. So that's why I mentioned those books.
And Mary asks, or says, I'm always interested in just, how ancestors traveled from the colonies to the Midwest and beyond in earlier times like the 1800s. What are some good sources for understanding those migration paths and motivations for moving?
Probably the best is a reprint that we did And I'm trying to think of the exact title.
It's the I think it's the
Expansion,
expansion. Yeah,
yes.
the expansion of New England, and it has a very long subtitle. It's basically from New England to the Mississippi and all states in between. Um, you can.
Yes, that is one of my favorite resources for understanding why people were going. Obviously, they would have done it in a variety of different ways. Most often, water travel, if that was available to them, that was the easiest way to do so. It was just less cumbersome than trying to go, with your oxen and wagon, because that was very bumpy and very painful. So if they had a way to do part of the trip by water, they would have elected to do so.
And that full title is, so it's The Expansion of New England, The Spread of New England Settlement and Institutions to the Mississippi River, 1620 to 1865. It's by Lois Kimball Matthews, and it is available in our bookstore, and it is an older volume, but there are some fantastic maps in there too, really showing where people are coming from, where they're going to, why they're going to these different locations. So I love that book. I think it's such a great kind of context builder. Um, so a few other questions. Barbara asks, what are the major updates to the upcoming new edition of the Genealogist Handbook to New England Research? You know, what are those major changes? Should I wait until next year to buy the new version rather than, getting the 5th edition now?
Ooh, tough question. I mean, we're trying to adhere to obviously the overall layout of the book, but we're updating obviously all of the websites, because no two places ever stay the same over a period of years, so that's all being double checked, triple checked, etc. We are doing some things with the charts to make them much more user friendly and one-stop shopping for you. So whereas you might have had to look at maybe 2 or 3 different places in the book for other, in the current edition, we're looking to make that much easier for you, more seamless. We're going to also make it easier for you to find the charts in the volumes and give you a much better table of contents, among other things.
Thank you. Let's see, a few other questions here. Robert asks, for Arnold's collection, do you know if the last group of volumes will be digitized and posted to our website?
I do not know if we will do that. I believe I saw something in the chat where somebody said that they gave a link to where to someone who had digitized them. I think I saw it go by on the chat while I was talking. So you might check that site out. I'm not involved with the web people for that kind of thing, so I don't know what they have like on the horizon, what their timeline is for certain things. The newspapers, I understand sort of why those didn't get done. The vital records were so much more important. You may be able to get the newspapers through other online databases, such as early American newspapers or Genealogy Bank and things like that, which are actually digitizing the newspapers. So I have not heard anything, but that doesn't mean it's not coming.
And I think that's something that, I can certainly write to the web team and let you know if there are any plans for that. Julie asks, can you explain why the Quaker records have no, I guess, just kind of the
No names?
yeah, well, the dating system, right? So why there are no month names, but just by this kind of numeric dating.
Oh, sure. So in the Quaker faith, they believe that those the names of the weeks and the names of the months are pagan, and they are correct in this. Most of our days of the week have been named after some kind of god, whether he be Greek, Roman, or Norse. And the same thing with a lot of our months up until you hit September. So that is their reason for not using them. And so instead they prefer to use just numbers.
All right. And Sharon asks or says, I had relatives in Little Compton early on. what time period was that part of Massachusetts, and where would I look for those records of Little Compton in Massachusetts?
So the good news is, and I'm kind of going back on my copy of this for just a second so I don't give you the wrong thing. So Little Compton was part of the section of Bristol County, Massachusetts that got carved off in 1746. Now the good news is that things like vital records prior to 1746 are still going to be in Little Compton. So Little Compton's, anything that was kept on the town level in Massachusetts will have just been carved off and gone with the town, because nothing happened to the town's hall. Like the town hall, it was merely, now instead of being part of Massachusetts, you're part of Rhode Island. Where you may see some issues prior to 1746 would be in land and probate, which are on the county level in Massachusetts. So in certain situations, you may find yourself having to look at Bristol County for these earlier land and probate records for your family. So that's the big thing. The town records, the vital records that we're talking about right now would not be affected, because all the New England states, all of the vital records are done on a town level.
And Madeline asks, is early Rehoboth in Rhode Island or Massachusetts records? And maybe you could also walk through, if people have other questions about specific towns, how would you kind of see, if it was Massachusetts or Rhode Island or Connecticut?
So to the best of my knowledge, Rehoboth never went back and forth. And it's one of those things, again, where the only time it's really going to affect you is going to be with the probate and land records, because the vital records would be at the Rehoboth Town Hall. So most, you can kind of look at that section where the towns of, Barrington, Bristol, Cumberland, Little Compton, etc., where they are located, and that's kind of the section that got carved off and put over. It was, I want to say something like, I don't know, 3-6 mile, like if you drew a straight line that got where the border was adjusted in that 1663 charter. So that's what caused the back and forth of, no, this is my space, this is your space. I have not, because I do have family in Rehoboth, I have not had an issue with that. Anything in that did have any boundary issues, it is addressed in the current edition of the Genealogist Handbook for New England, and obviously will continue into the newer edition as well.
And Lee asks about some of the issues between Rhode Island and Connecticut. You mentioned that briefly. Can you talk a little bit more about, what some of those boundary issues are that you need to be aware of? When did that what time period was that happening? And how does that affect your search for various records?
So most of that was during the early time, the 1600s. So it's less likely to be a major problem for you. Again, vital records on the town level, so that's a non-issue. With Connecticut, the probate is on a district level, so that could play into it in an early time frame. My rule of thumb is to always look at on both sides of the border if I'm not finding something that I expected to find, especially if I've got vital records for the town that say, yeah, these people were here. With the land, Connecticut does land on the town level. So again, anything it's possible might end up in some random book on the town level for those towns that stay with Rhode Island. Because Rhode Island also does the town level, so for the land records, so it's less of a problem between those two states for that. It would only be the probate district that might get involved from a Connecticut standpoint. And as I said, it's super early, and it wasn't as hard as like a hard boundary as with Rhode Island and Massachusetts.
All right. And Brian asks, is there a Rhode Island source, a published source for Huguenots in the area about 1750? Anything that you could suggest there?
You know, I am trying to think if I've seen anything for Rhode Island, but let's see here. There are certainly, the first thing would obviously be if you've got a specific town, look to see if you've got a town history or something. But I have to tell you that my greatest go-to is usually things to do a search on Google for, Huguenots in Rhode Island, and then look under the More tab on Google and look for the books, because they're, anything having to do with the history of the state or, early social history of the people, etc., will give you information about, those early religious settlements. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay, and one final question. So Jean asks, can you confirm uh, the date of the first day of the year for Quakers?
Um, in a word, no. We take it based on the change from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, which, if you were English, did not happen until 1752. Other countries did things earlier. So in essence, we make an assumption that because they are English and coming into America and thus, continuing that their first day of the year is the same as what it was for the rest of the colonies. It would not make sense for them to have like the 1st of January for theirs, and then the rest are doing it with the 25th of March. So we do make an assumption there, and it can be frustrating, which is one of the reasons why with the Quaker dates it's so important to include your original Quaker date as well.
All right. So let's move on, and we're going to move on to probate. So I'll turn it back over to you, Rhonda.
Thank you. So probate records. I'm not altogether sure that a lot of people like to use probate and land records. I have been using them since I started doing genealogy way back in longer than I'm going to admit to being alive. So we'll just leave it at that. But I find that the probate and land, which are going to be talked about here together, they can give you some great insight into families. Now, the good news, and what you've probably already figured out from some of the answers to questions, was that Rhode Island maintains their probate records at the town level. Pretty much everything except for court records is maintained on the town level when it comes to Rhode Island. What this means, though, is that the town clerk's got a lot of books he's got to shuffle. So sometimes he may not always put things in the right book. He may lump some things together. And so sometimes you may have to look at like the town meeting books where he's just putting everything in there and he's just handling his town's business on the whole. So if you don't find something in the probate record volumes, keep in mind they've all got town meeting books. See what you can find there. And we're going to have a little exercise here in an ugly record. Unfortunately, many of the earliest of the probate records for Rhode Island look sort of like this, especially if you are looking in areas of Providence County. There is some destruction, and the records have been saved and put into these volumes so that what is still available can still be used. And they do something where that's called it's called silking, and it's not affecting this particular record too much, but basically it's what keeps the record from disintegrating further, tearing, etc. But it's like a see-through covering that they put on it, and when it's microfilmed, it can sometimes make things super, super dark. But what you're seeing is that back page that you're seeing is where it has been attached to in a newer book. And the writing can sometimes because those edges disappear, can make it hard sometimes to find everybody in a particular document. So in this case here with the will of Elisha Clark, it is his will, and he is mentioning, a lot of people, as you can tell by all of this red. He mentions his wife, Desire Clark, and so the upper top, before you start to see the arrows pointing to things, that's all him saying, I'm of sound mind, take care of my debts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Standard, what we would call boilerplate in today's parlance, legal stuff. Then we get into the I will and, give or whatever, and that's where we start to see the names. Now, after he talks about his wife, because she's usually the first one that gets talked about, then he starts mentioning some other things. And in one instance here, he talks about some land that he got from his brother, and then, of course, heaven forbid that the brother's first name should be there, is cut off, and it just says brother, and I left that blank, and Clark. And then there's a full follow-up sentence that talks about some land that he purchased from a Carrie Clark. I cannot assume that those are the same people. As we move to the second page, now we are getting his children. And it starts with the son Gardner. Then we get some information about, again, land that he acquired from his deceased brother, Joseph Clark. Then we have a son, Elisha, and a son, Isaac, and a son, Jabez, and then an unnamed son because his name bit the bullet. And then I underlined one specific little part of this because it kind of plays an important role. It mentions a piece of property in Nova Scotia. This was a 3-page will, so as we go on to our third page of the will, the last page of it, we see some additional people. We see a Benjamin Clark who is mentioned, and you can see I highlighted him twice because the top, he kind of gets, he's in that corner section that's disappeared, and then he is further on down spelled out, so I can say with certainty that it is him because I can tell that the top was the BENJ, the start of Benjamin. And then there is a daughter who unfortunately doesn't have a name in this, again, because hers has disappeared, and then a daughter named Abigail Clark that I have highlighted. And then in this instance, I underlined something that I found very, very important, that these people were getting a 1/5 part of the land in Nova Scotia. So then I went back and I started to look at all of these, and this is where reading an entire document is super important, even if it looks like this, because by doing that, I was able to make some understanding of his family, so to speak. It appears that Elisha has mentioned 7 children. Gardner, Elisha, Isaac, and Jabez, the unknown son, Benjamin, and then Abigail, who I believe is also the unnamed daughter. And the reason for that is that all of the Gardner and Isaac get other lands and other things. And then the remaining 5 children get this 1/5 part of that land in Nova Scotia. And since that is listed in the paragraph where the daughter's name is kind of cut off, I can feel kind of good about making that assumption that in this case, that is also about Abigail, because it's all sort of blended together, and I don't see where he has indicated that Abigail has gotten way more of a share, so to speak, somewhere else. So that's why I kind of feel like that unnamed daughter is Abigail. But again, you can see how, because we do have this record destruction, it becomes really, really important to read everything in the actual document to get a sense of, okay, Gardner's getting his extra lands, etc. Maybe he's the oldest son. Then we have Isaac, who's also getting some special lands, neither of which get anything mentioning, have anything in their, their stuff that alludes to Nova Scotia. but they're both identified as sons. And then the remaining 5 get this 1/5 part of the Nova Scotia lands, which is a common thing to do with a family where you carve up a piece and everybody gets a piece, and then obviously those 5 would probably sell it together and then split the money. So this is an example of why, yes, the records may look ugly. You may think you're not going to get anything, and yet there's quite a bit of information here. Moving on to our deed records. Like I said, like all other records, the deeds are found on the town level. There is no statewide index to either the probate records or the land records. So it's not like I can go and look up something for all of Rhode Island. I got to know my town. So it's really, really important that you know that. Unfortunately, the town level indexes can be somewhat inconsistent. So just keep that in mind. Also, like the other records, we got busy town clerks. He's grabbing this book, that book, the other book. He may grab the wrong book on occasion. So diligence is necessary. Don't give up. Look at other books and see if things got randomly put in the wrong place. So here we're going to look at the Providence Deeds, Volume 1. And I kind of picked this super early stuff because the writing can be very curlicue, can be very hard to read. There are paleography books that can help you with some of that, but these records are so important, and the deeds often tell you who they're living, like who owns the surrounding land, etc. So it can play a very, very important role, especially if you cannot find probate for somebody. You're going to get usually when somebody is selling land, you're going to get the wife's first name, and that helps you maybe in separating out 2 people by the same, like two Benjamin Smiths. Maybe one's got a wife Mary and the other one has a wife Jane, and they're selling land at the same times. That allows you to separate them out. What I really liked about this particular example was the fact that one of the deed on the left is pretty much a standard deed where we see everything written out in a narrative style. The meets and bounds, which is the method of survey used in New England, is, stumps, trees, waterways, somebody else's land, etc. And so by the time you've read that whole thing, it can be a little confusing and you've forgotten where you started on that piece of property. So what I loved was seeing in this second page, it's actually 2 very short deeds, and then they showed how the pieces of property kind of butt up against each other and drew it out, and they included for us the various points in the meets and bounds. So for instance, the upper left-hand corner of our little square drawing, it is a spoked black oak. And he's written, and he's even drawn a little black oak that kind of has a Y shape to it. And then we have other items with, this, the white oaks, etc. But what's interesting is that he has told us how he is measuring this survey. So you see kind of like a little bridge in the center of the 2 rectangles, and it's actually going over a spring. Right below that, he is talking about the fact that he is using a certain number of poles. So he's measuring in poles, which is one of the methods in which they would do it. And then he's saying that, this is done to 20 poles. So when you see things like the 80 up top, the 280s, that's telling you that's 80 poles. All right. Now, obviously, you'd have to go out and convert that to present day, but he's giving you everything there, and you get to see the 2 pieces of property and how they kind of, lock to each other. Another example in the Providence deeds is this deed here, and this is one that has again been recreated, and I know this because you can kind of see along the outer edges that the page is shorter than the book, and this again was a method of preserving. So in this instance, we have a Robert Williams of Newport who is selling to Will Huffkins Sr., also of Newport, but the piece of property is in Providence, which is why this deed is in the Providence deeds. And that the purchase was, the property was purchased by the town of Providence from the Indians. So again, you can see these are very hard to read. There's very flourishy. They're going back into the English kind of style of writing. So paleography does play a part, but we know that the land that he has come into was originally purchased by the town from the Indians. So it's very possible that he was afforded that piece of property as an early proprietor or something. That might be in the town books, not in the deed books. So again, reading the whole document, very, very important. And then if we blow up that, our drawing again, you can see in more detail the scale, the bridge, etc., and then how he's arranging it. So he's drawn it on the page, but notice that north is actually to the east in this case, and the south is to the west. So the land actually was would be flipped if you were going out to look at it. So anything like this that you can get a better sense of how the land is arranged, when things are happening, how they're being, surveyed, etc. This will help you to understand better, especially as you work your way back into these super early deeds where the writing may not be great. All righty, church records. Obviously, one of the benefits of going to Rhode Island was the 1663 charter that granted religious, the lack of religious persecution. So you see a lot of these early religions that were ostracized in some of the other New England states, which is kind of, ironic when you consider that people were coming over for a religious freedom, a separation of kind of church and state situation from England, and yet now that they're over here, we go from being pilgrims who want that to being Puritans who only want a certain religion. So other religions are ostracized, threatened, etc. So Rhode Island becomes like a safe haven. And you get these early Quaker records. Baptisms, marriages, and burials obviously may exist where perhaps the town's records don't, for whatever reason. Could be because the guy just didn't get into town to tell the clerk, or it could be, record destruction. Unfortunately, it does happen. But don't ignore any of the business records or other records for denomination. We focus so heavily on baptisms, marriages, and burials that we ignore anything in a card catalog, a library catalog, that doesn't say those words. And that can actually set you up to build your own brick walls. Especially when it comes to your Quaker records, keep in mind that the men and women don't sit together. They have separate, sides of the room, and then they have their own separate meetings. And the meeting minutes are, in addition to announcing things like, oh yeah, John and Mary want to get married, and they have to go through, I think it was like 3 meetings where they had to profess that, etc. And the mention of, births and other things. There's also business that's going on. And in the women's meetings, that often had things to do with, somebody who may be straying from the faith, and perhaps, we're going to form a little committee and we're going to send that committee off to see if they can, bring her back into the fold, etc. And in this particular instance, about halfway down, we see that there is a notation which is taking place. So this whole page is from the 28th day of the first month of 1727. And after the notes about the marriages, etc., which is up top, we see that there is a little notation about the concern about the birth of a child to Susanna Buffington that came earlier or sooner than most women give birth. So they're obviously going to look into this because perhaps there was, some namby-pamby going on or something that is not acceptable, and she may have to confess her sin to be forgiven, etc. So they're going to look into that. Then there's also in other things where they may have committees that are going to go and join with women of other of the monthly meetings, and maybe those individuals are going to go to the yearly meeting. They have a very strict hierarchy of their meetings, and that can help you to understand maybe also where a specific meeting might come out of for where you're looking. But the meeting minutes can give you much more than just your basic vital records. Obviously, in other denominations, we expect to find things like these church marriages, which unfortunately are very straight and to the point. We just have the groom and the bride and a date, and that's it. That is pretty typical for the early records, especially of the other denominations like the Episcopals, etc. And then one of my favorite go-to records for church records that has nothing to do with vital records is the pew deeds and or the pew rentals. We don't think of this as being a thing you can own in present day, but in many instances in the churches, you purchased your pew, and that was your pew. You sat there, nobody else sat there, it was yours. And so oftentimes you may find in early probate records where somebody is bequeathing their pew as part of their inventory. It's being put into a person's inventory, and then it's either being sold off if they need the money to pay off debts, etc. In other cases, such as we see here with Trinity Church, this is an actual pew deed in, I want to say it's like 1832 or something, 1829. And the person is selling this pew, which is situated in the middle aisle of Trinity Church, numbered 74. And he's getting $100 for the pew. So that's a lot of money for a little place to sit. It can, like I said, other places may do pew rentals, but what this does is it sort of can fill in gaps. What you can see is, oh, this person was here and they were here long enough that they owned a pew. So yes, there would have been visitor pews for people who were just passing through. This person owned the pew, and you might be able to track back through the pew deeds, how they acquired the pew themselves, etc. So think of it in terms of almost like land and property. There may be a paper trail. We're going to move on now to our state census records. And for Rhode Island, most of the state records begin in 1865, going up through 1935. And once again, the 1890s, we've just got issues with that particular, 10-year period. But there is an 1855 census that exists just for Providence City only. And then 1895, all was lost except Warrentown and Bristol County. 1935 is comprised of computer cards. So it's, definitely a different animal. Big tip on when using these state census records is you need to pay close attention to the entries on the page. We get so used to looking at census pages that we tend to just look for our person and we may ignore what's around us. I'm going to show you that's a bad way to look at the Rhode Island records. For instance, if we look at this 1885 Rhode Island census in the town of Warwick, taken June 1st, 1885 or thereabouts. And as we look at the very top person, we see a Julia E. Henry. She's 28 years old. She is listed as a daughter. A daughter to who? She's just sort of floating out there in the middle of nowhere. And this is a 2-page spread, which is also another unusual aspect of census records because we're used to it fitting all on a single page. I did look at the image before this to see if, dad or mom was on the page before. No, she's just sort of floating out there in no man's land. Then I started looking at every one of our columns here. And I've circled or I've boxed in red the columns that are very, very important to us to be able to find the rest of her family. And in this instance, it's the first column, which is the district, which is 192. The second column, which gives us the family number. And then the third column says how many in the family. There are 3. So there are 2 other people I have to find for this particular family. The other thing you'll notice as you're looking at this particular blow up page, every person on this page is a female. So that alone tells me that we're not seeing the family as it was originally enumerated and structured. We're seeing whatever the town or the state needed from its state census. And so they were separating out people by some kind of criteria. So I went to Ancestry, and one of the good things about Ancestry is that you can, number one, you can narrow down to the area of Warwick in 1885. Obviously, I'm looking for Henry's, so I put that given name in, and I got 11 hits. That is not bad. And I don't have to look at each image. So all the way on the far right, yes, you can see view images. I don't even have to click on view record and go through each one of these people separately. If you put your cursor over the view record, you will get a little pop-up. And the pop-up gives us what we care most about. So in going through this, there was a Mary Henry, born in Ireland, who was in the enumeration district of 192. She's in the household of 344. Those 2 things together would allow me then to say, yes, she is somebody I am interested in. Then I can click on the view image and find her on the page. So now I've got mom, yay. And she's widowed. She's there's no age for her. And that was because of a darkening of the image. It's really hard to read, so they didn't put in any age. So this is another good example of why you can't give too much information. Less is always best. If I had said, oh, well, she's probably born, between 1840 and whatever, and I did a plus or minus, there's nothing in that. And so Ancestry wouldn't have given her to me. So use the things that are going to be consistent. So then I went looking at the remaining people and again used this little pop-up thing and found again a boy, William Henry, who is also in the enumeration district of 192, household of 344. And through that, I was able to look at the images, and they're like all over the place. They are so far apart from each other, it's ridiculous. But that's why it's really important to read all the columns, not just head for the person and the age and where they're born. Look at everything, because that's the only way you're going to put this 1885 census together. Similar situation with the 1935 census, because it's all computer cards. And so in this instance, I have an Annette Healy, who is living on Cottage Grove Ave in Warwick in Kent County. And the first thing I did was I went to look and see if she was single. If she was single or widowed, I might have expected, depending on her age, to see if she was, still a daughter of somebody, or if she was an older woman, maybe she's living with a family, etc. What I did not see was in box number 5, which is just below Kent, on the left-hand side, it asks if this is the head of the household. And there's nothing filled out there, so that tells me she's not. So there's got to be more people in this household. She was married, so once again, I went looking. And I actually used Family Search for this one, partly because of the way in which they abstracted some of the information. So I obviously I put in Annette Healy first, and then I just went with Healy's once I knew what I was looking for. But you can see here that Annette Healy, it shows her living on Cottage Grove Ave in Warwick, Kent, Rhode Island. And I then began to scroll down and look for another person residing in that same on that same street. And sure enough, came up with a William D. Healy, who's roughly 4 years older than her. And so I went and I looked at his card, and his card offered me the all important, I am the head of the household and I have 2 people in my family. So in essence, by finding his card, I now know that Annette and he are the only 2 people in this household. And not surprisingly, they've probably just recently gotten married because she's, Annette's like 19 at this point. So again, young couple, just married, don't have any children. But you can see how if you don't do that, you're not going to get the full picture of this state census. And of course, we've got cemeteries. We all love cemeteries. Some people say I love them a little too much. I've been known to have whole days walking around in cemeteries. But the go-to source for Rhode Island is the Rhode Island Historical Cemetery, 1647 to 2000, which is searchable on American Ancestors as well as on the Rhode Island Historical Cemetery Commission website. Also on American Ancestors, you can browse. Sometimes when I can browse things on American Ancestors, I'll do that as opposed to maybe somewhere else just because I'm more familiar with how our browse works. But to give you a view of the Rhode Island Historical Cemetery Commission's page, here you see they have a number of different gravestone search capabilities, including first and last name, a word in a note field. So if you were looking, if you knew somebody had a specific type of stone, that might be in the note field because they do include in their notes on this site what the tombstones are made of, etc. Or, if you're looking for maiden names or if it's a veteran in a war, etc. So this can be a good one. They've got great cemetery maps, etc. As I mentioned, on American Ancestors, you can browse based on locality, in this case, town. You can just pull down the list and it's alphabetically arranged by town, and you can click a town, and then usually what I do is whatever pops up first is, the one that I go with, and then I maneuver back and forth from there. I don't look for page 1. Sometimes it doesn't, they're not arranged that way. But once I know how they're arranged, I may start from the front. Sometimes I'll just start from the back, depending. But in this, to give you an idea of what this can look like, I went ahead and used our search capability, and I put in a man by the name of Abel Tripp and found a couple of hits for him. And I don't worry too much about the overall number of hits that I see, like 1 to 50 of 1,398. Usually the ones I care most about are going to be my top hits. And I can also further refine my search if there's too many of them. So you can see at the top, Abel Tripp, 1833 is his death. And we can view the image. And there's also if you click his name, you get this, which has the abstract, which is basically the things that are searchable. And then you see the image in a small box, which you can then click on, and that will give you a full image that you could download. Okay. And they have a lot of tombstones in here. So it's one of my go-tos, especially for things that are past 1900, where I'm maybe trying to get a feel for something, for somebody in Rhode Island, and I'm trying to get a sense of maybe when I need to narrow my search for a death. Is it something I can physically do by using our available microfilms that we have in our research center, or do I have to right away to the town hall to get a death? And that depends on when the death took place.
All right, so let's pause here again and answer some questions. Go ahead and type your question into the chat panel. So Donna asks, kind of going back to Quaker meetings, what is that hierarchy that you spoke of? And I do want to mention that we do have a subject guide on our website. I posted the direct link there, but you can also just find it on our website, AmericanAncestors.org, under Learn, Subject Guides, and then you can browse them A to Z, and we have one on Quaker records with several links to, of course, different websites, different resources, different databases. So if you do want to learn more about Quaker records, I do suggest that you check out that subject guide. Anything else that you want to say, Rhonda, about either the hierarchy or Quaker records in general?
So the biggest thing with the Quaker records is that we're so used to thinking of a specific like local church that everybody went to. And with the Quakers, those churches were sometimes spread out. And so their meetings were done monthly. There's a reason they're called monthly meetings. And so sometimes, once a month, they all gather from however far away to go to this one place and conduct their business, etc. But the hierarchy tends to be the smallest being the monthly meeting. And then you have one of the biggest is the yearly meeting. And to give you an idea of how big a yearly meeting can be, the New York yearly meeting encompassed parts of Canada as well as parts of New England. So the yearly meeting can be this giant thing. And then very often you have monthly meetings that have, as they get big or as more people move into an area, a new meeting will be kind of like carved off of it. And they have other types of names for those as well. And some of that will show up in the PDF to the New England Quaker meeting minutes that I included in your handout.
And Gay asks, do you know of any business meeting minutes for the Sabbatarians of Newport, and where might you start to look if those exist?
I will be honest, I am not even familiar with the Sabbatarians, so I would encourage you to please email me, and I will do my best to see what I can find for you.
Great. And Lee asks, where would you find those pew deeds and pew rental records? Where would you find them, if available online or physically? Where would you kind of seek those out?
So generally speaking, my first thing is with a church is to see, is it still in operation? If it is, that may be where you find your records. And I say may because a lot of these churches have been around for a long, long time, and they don't have space, nor do they have the proper environment to preserve things from, say, the 1600s. So they often will turn them over on deposit to a local historical society or other manuscript capable institution. For instance, this is a Massachusetts one, but the Old North Church's records are actually on deposit at Mass Historical Society. And they are in their original format: books, pages, papers, folders, etc. And so for the Rhode Island stuff, it might be one of the things that I would look at the Rhode Island Historical Society if I couldn't find them through microfilmed records. That's so after I see if the church is still in existence, but if I'm researching old enough records, I'm going to look to see if Family Search got in and was able to do any microfilming of the records. That church records is high on their list of things that they want to be able to do, so I often will find it there. And then, as I said, I'll branch out to either a town historical society, because the towns in Rhode Island often have their own historical societies, or I might look at larger county or state societies as well for these types of manuscripts.
But it sounds like you would need to know what, the denomination and the church, preferably in the time period? Yeah.
Absolutely. That is critical.
Now, Kathleen says or asks, can I rely on the quote millennium file records that I find on Ancestry? There is a record, but not the original data, which is in Salt Lake City. So those millennium files, can you rely on them?
Ugh, I don't. You might use it as a breadcrumb trail, but I would never cite it as a source. I'm not quite sure where some of that stuff from what they called their Millennium Files came from. They had a few things where over the years, since they've gotten so heavily into the online world, where they had sort of algorithms that were grabbing things out of records and trying to match people up, etc. So I take anything where I can't see an original record with a large bunch of salt and see if I can verify it elsewhere off of that particular database. It may give you point the arrow for you, but I'm not going to use it as my source, and I'm certainly not going to trust it.
All right, thank you. So let's move on to the final section for tonight, which is on repositories, and you've already mentioned a few, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. So let's talk repositories, because again, in this digital age, especially now, I mean, let's face it, thank goodness for the digital age, because as genealogists, we would be able to do nothing if we couldn't go anywhere. But repositories are still very, very important. And in Rhode Island, I have listed what I consider to be our top 4, and then mentioned in general City Archives and Historical Society. So there's the Rhode Island State Archives, Rhode Island State Library, the Rhode Island Supreme Judicial Court Records Center, and the Rhode Island Historical Society. Now, some of these records may exist digitally over on Family Search. When Family Search's people go into areas, they don't just go into the town halls, they also try to get records from other places. And so some of the records that you might be interested in may be available someplace where you can access them without having to physically go to one of these repositories. Each of the repositories, I have included the URL. It's included in your handout, so we're not going to worry so much about that. The state archives, obviously 2020, there were a lot of anniversaries this year that are sort of getting completely and utterly obliterated because of COVID, including women's suffrage. So the Rhode Island State Archives has a lovely thing about that, but there's also other aspects of the records, including online catalog and digital archives, that you want to look for. Those are buzzwords to look for on any website of any kind of repository. When it comes to using or looking at any website of any of these repositories, big tip, always check out your digital collections. Even if you think you don't think you'll find something, you may be surprised. So in the Rhode Island State Archives, we do have the online catalog and the digital archives. When you click that, you get a whole new view, and it looks very fancy. We have a lovely, historic photograph, and then browse the digital collections. I'm a huge browser, and the reason that I browse is because if I'm coming into this, I don't necessarily know what they have digitally available. So I like to browse so I can kind of eyeball different collections and say, oh, that looks interesting. Let me see what I can do with it. And so clicking on the Browse Digital Records will give you an alphabetical list of the various collections that they currently have available in a digital format. Keep in mind that some of these may sound like they're not of interest to you. I'm going to beg to differ with you, because there could be some really important kernel of understanding for why your family did something or why they had to move hidden in one of these collections, especially if it's talking about the business and operation of a town or the state in its entirety. But one of the ones that immediately caught my eye for this particular class was the state institutions, because that's not something you find very often just kind of out there on the web. And so I was curious to see what they included in this collection. And so I went ahead and clicked on that. and discovered that we had quite a few different projects that were available. And one that I found particularly interesting was a book that they've digitized called Hazards Report on the Poor and Insane in Rhode Island, 1851. Obviously, long time ago, but could explain why all of a sudden, Aunt Margaret disappears. So I wanted to see what kind of information I could get from this book. I clicked on it, and again, take your time. We have gotten so used to typing in a name and going to a page that we almost feel like we don't know what to do otherwise. This is a situation where you can really play and really get to understand things. So the first thing I did was I clicked on that report. It took me to this view, and I started to look through page by page, predominantly because I wanted to see the index or table of contents to see how it was arranged. And sure enough, we got it with obviously Newport, Portsmouth. These towns aren't necessarily in alphabetical order, but it's telling me some of the things that I'm going to be able to find, statistics, etc. And I continued to go through and look at various pages, and all of a sudden I came upon Newport, and I don't know why Newport jumped out at me, because I'll be honest, all of the reports from the towns look the same. But for some reason, Newport, maybe because it was a half page, just sort of jumped out at me. And I started to look at this report from the individual who had gone to the Newport Asylum and had gathered the following statistics. What I found most interesting was that there was, obviously we had the females and the males kind of separate again. They're really big on that in Rhode Island. And so I noticed all these females, and I'm like, but what are those letters? Again, I don't ever accept what I'm looking at surface value. I've got to know more. And so I started looking at this, and I thought, this is great information because it's telling me the age of the person, how long they've been in the asylum, where they were born, whether they were married or single, and the cause, the reason for them being there. And I got to thinking about some of these people who were had been in there long enough to would be enumerated in the 1850 census, which would have enumerated any institutions in the town. And so the first one that I went looking for was predominantly because he was born in Germany, so that would stand out as I did a search. Just so that I could find the institution's pages. Now, usually you find institutions such as this at the end of a town's enumerations. Rhode Island put, at least for this particular, for Newport, they put them at the front. It's the first 2 pages of the Newport census for 1850. And what I was able to discover was I could match those initials with people. And so here you can see that over on the left-hand side, I have Candace Sherman, who was 67 years old. She's a female, and she's been in the institution for 30 years, which, of course, the census doesn't tell me that. The census just tells me she's in the institution and she's blind. It's the statistics in this report that tell me she's been there for a very long time. And that tells me that the 1850 census is the first census where she's going to be listed by name, and explains why maybe I'll never find her in earlier, in the earlier censuses for that reason. Also, I can't help wondering if she was blind from birth and that she ends up going to the asylum, maybe because, her parents die and now there's nobody who can take care of her. You just don't know these things. Then I found, as I said, with Henry, or with Martin, I'm sorry, that he was listed as an idiot in the census. Now, idiot can take many, many variations, one of them having to do with insanity. And that is the case with Martin, because Martin in the statistics says that he has he is insane for an unknown reason. Sometimes they know why, what caused it, etc. Maybe a hit to the head or something. His is an unknown reason. So again, even though this may not have anything to do with my personal ancestors, by understanding how this book works and being able to connect it with another record that I'm very comfortable with allows me then, if I do have, say, somebody in, Providence or New Shoreham or something, I can then look and see if I can find out more about what happened to my person. The Rhode Island State Library, everybody right now has the "we are closed because of" and do look through our online catalogs, etc. Obviously, a state library, they have very specific goals, more so than your state archive, in what they handle. And so sometimes your state library is not as genealogically helpful, but you can certainly look at the library catalog, which will give you some information possibly about what you might be able to find. So as I scrolled down the page, I did look at things like their programs, their collections, etc. And over on the right, you can see some of their collections, which kind of give you an idea of what their focus is, which is pretty much the business of running the state of Rhode Island, which makes sense. But I went ahead and I went to the library catalog, and I went ahead and did just a genealogy search, and there were like 30 books. So it would not necessarily be my go-to for that, but it may be for some of these business type things that could affect the town in which my ancestors lived. So that's why the state library can be very, very important. The Rhode Island Judiciary Records Center, I like to liken it to here in Massachusetts, where we have a literally like a judicial offset, where you can go for early records. We have an archivist, etc. Similar situation here with Rhode Island. That doesn't mean you can't get these records some other way, such as on microfilm, or via digital images through family search, etc. But again, this tells me sort of what they have and the time periods. So I went to archives research, and that showed me kind of the hierarchy of records that they have. And obviously not everything probably do they have everything that dates back to 1671. Maybe they have like one record. We're not talking tons and tons of records for every year. These are their extremes. They have something as early as 1671, and their cutoff was 1900. But one of the things that you'll find is that you could find your civil and your criminal cases here. Again, remember, court cases in Rhode Island are the only thing handled by the county. Everything else on the town level. But then we have our divorce cases, and we have naturalization papers. So if you've got, Azorians who came in to Bristol, Rhode Island, it's very possible that their naturalization papers may be found in the Judicial Records Center. So again, just another place to look and get more information. The Rhode Island Historic Society is one of my go-tos for things, more so when I can go, because its research center, the Mary Elizabeth Robinson Research Center, which you kind of see up in the grid by all the pictures, is a go-to place for a lot of records. It's in a wonderful building, brick building, and it, unfortunately, they have just now opened for, I think they have very specific things that they are doing now. So the museum parts are open, the walking tour, I think it's all by appointment only. But under their research, there is their collections, which shows up in the pull down, which is usually where you would find it. And I really love to see kind of in broad strokes how big the collections are, especially if it's a center I've never been to. And so that's usually how I get to something like you see here, where we've got the graphic collections, the manuscripts, all sorts of different collections, and how many of each do they have? So 17,000 reels of microfilm, that's huge. 1,200 manuscript collections. Now, a manuscript collection could be a single letter to a multi-box collection, okay? 1,200, very impressive. So there were going to be things there that might prove of interest to me, again, once we are open and allowed to go to places. And then, as I mentioned, sort of any city, town in Rhode Island, see if they have some kind of city archive, town archive, etc., and see what they may have. For instance, for Providence, they have what's known as a military discharge papers index. And the index years are supposed to be quite broad, but they do highlight the fact that the bulk of the collection is for those soldiers returning home from World War II who are now trying to get a discount on their taxes for property. And so you can view it. I will tell you that the easiest way to get these images to come up is to use Firefox. I tried every browser I had on my computer because I was like, no, Firefox, I don't have to use that. Well, yes, I do. So this had to do with property tax exemptions. But what's really great about it is that it's arranged again alphabetically. You can click on the number as you're viewing the records themselves as we get into the collection. And you'll see the alphabet above. You can click on a letter and then eventually get yourself to a very specific person. And so we'll tell you, the date. It gives you information about the fact that he had a military discharge, he was in the US Army. This is all valuable information that you might be able to use to work further back. Even though it's very contemporary information, it may help you in getting maybe his military papers, etc. So again, I always look to see what's available, and I think in the broad, not in the very specific of I'm looking for just this one person. In addition to all of these types of places, of course, always Family History Library and Family Search, obviously, familysearch.org. And then we have a large collection at the New England Historic Genealogical Society's Library, Research Center, on microfilm, but also on our AmericanAncestors.org website that deals with Rhode Island specific.
All right. Well, thanks again, Rhonda. So let's pause here one last time and see if you have any questions. Go ahead and type them into the chat panel. And of course, if we don't get to your question tonight, or if you have maybe a more specific question, you can always reach Rhonda directly by email. You'll find her email as well as all of the instructors' emails on the course webpage. So Douglas asks, we talked about looking for land records and deeds at the town level. What are some of the best practices in tracing deeds and then finding the property's location? Any suggestions there?
So the first thing is that when you're working in deeds, whether it be at the town level in Rhode Island or at the county level, anywhere else, you need to do due diligence of all the records. And to do that, you have to keep track of all of the acreage that's being purchased and all the acreage that's being sold. If those two numbers don't equal each other, there's missing paper. Could be a probate. It could be, as I mentioned, the proprietor records where somebody got a piece of property before things started getting entered into deed records. Obviously, the meets and bounds do make things a little difficult in taking something from, say, the 1700s into present day. It might be possible to follow the records forward to present day and see, once we've got addresses and things, you might be able to then more easily identify it on a map. Or you could look for an older map and kind of overlay maybe a see-through version of the town in question to get a sense of where that land would lay in the present arrangement of a town. There's a lot of different ways to do it. The meets and bounds does make it tough because they're usually talking trees, stumps, boulders, etc., rather than, a road or waterways, etc. So it can be a little more difficult. But the biggest thing is that you've got to be very diligent. You've got to look at all of the grantee indexes, all of the grantor indexes, and go through them all systematically, adding up all of that acreage. Keep in mind that you didn't have to register a deed until you had to prove your right to sell it. So that can sometimes be 20, 30, 50 years later.
And Lee asks, you mentioned that the Rhode Island birth index may be found in certain repositories. Um, can you just tell us, I think you mentioned this, but where are those? How would you go about searching for them? Suggestions there.
So we actually have an index that's on our on AmericanAncestors.org that you could try. In fact, as we're talking, I'm going to try that. But they on microfilm and in their original format that I showed you online, it showed you here in our talk, you will find that they are those digital images may be available through Family Search. The microfilms, as I mentioned, would be available through us, as well as the Family History Library out in Salt Lake City. They no longer send microfilm to any of the local family history centers. It got too expensive to redo, to recreate those films. But we have okay, so we just have for Providence an alphabetical index list. We do not have an all-encompassing for all of Rhode Island, so it would have to be those microfilms and the digital images through Family Search. Or, as I said, you could go, the Historical Society would have them as well on microfilm.
And it might be worth, since so many of the records are, just about all of the records are kept at the town level, if you do want to find, whether Family Search has records for a town, can you kind of talk through searching the catalog, the family search catalog?
Oh, absolutely. So usually we go to Family Search, we search records, we type in a name, we don't find something, and we go away. Ignore the search records. Further down, when you put the cursor over search, when you click on search, further down you're going to see the word catalog. That's going to open up a different screen and it defaults to a place search. So you could start to type in the town of that you're interested in. And then it's going to populate like with a little drop down with choices. So obviously something like, Tiverton, I'm not going to find tons of those. Providence, I might find a few others, but look at that drop down until you find, the town, which will be listed in its county in Rhode Island in the United States. And then the town is going to be the farthest right. And as you move to the left, you get the bigger kind of place. They don't use the word county in the catalog, so don't ever put that word in. You won't find anything. And then once you find your place, it will populate, click on it, it will populate the place field, click the search button, and you'll get the place name and then some subject headings of all sorts of different things, maybe cemeteries, church records, vital records, town records. That's where you're going to find all your stuff hiding.
All right, thank you. Well, it looks like those are all the questions for tonight. As I mentioned, you can certainly reach Rhonda directly by email. You'll find her email address on the course webpage. And speaking of that course webpage, here's the very long URL. I will send you a follow-up email once the recording is posted. Again, sharing this link, and I've shared it with you a few times already. But you'll find all of the materials, recordings, handouts, and other resources there on the course webpage. You have access to all of this material until the end of November. So I want to thank you again for joining us for this, for the 5th class in our 6-session seminar. Be sure to join us next week at the same time when Chris Child will discuss research in the state of Connecticut. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you online next week. Goodbye for now.